Welcome, everybody. My name is Graham Walker. I'm the president of Patrick Henry College. It's my privilege to welcome you to our Newsmakers interview series. We are delighted to have an exciting lineup this week. Dr. Marvin Olasky, the holder of our Distinguished Chair in Journalism and Public Policy, is conducting these recurring series of really quite extraordinary interviews with profound thinkers, creative writers, artists, newsmakers, and others. This week, we have, of course, today's guest, Os Guinness, as well as later in the week, Tucker Carlson tomorrow. Steve Forbes, Rosaria Butterfield, Kay Cole James, and others are in this lineup, which begins today and continues through, I think, Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken, through Wednesday of next week. Okay, yeah. So stay tuned and come back. And of course, we welcome the public, we welcome the students, faculty, residents of Purcellville, Loudoun County, and of course, we are joined by others. We don't know how many, but there could be several dozen people joining us by our live webcast. And of course, ultimately, the 400,000 readers of World Magazine around the world will be joining us in the written version of these interview experiences. As to Dr. Olasky, it's such a privilege having him here. If he were just a great guy, that would be enough. However, in addition, he's an accomplished journalist, scholar, academic leader, and author of more than 20 books and hundreds of articles on journalism, history, public policy, and on Christianity's intersection with public culture. And he has deeply enriched our community. So please, let's begin the series by giving him a warm thank you for his work. So we have the privilege today of having Dr. Os Guinness with us today. He received his doctorate at Oxford and was an associate of the late Francis Schaeffer. He was for a while a reporter for the British Broadcasting Company before coming to America in the 1980s. He founded the Trinity Forum in 1991, which you may have heard of. He's addressed audiences such as the British House of Commons, the U.S. Congress, and others. He's authored over 30 books. There are too many titles to list, but two of them I think are worth a special mention here. An earlier book called The Dust of Death, which had a great influence on many of us, and a more recent book which I think is fun to mention here because of the, shall we say, provocative title, Fit Bodies, Fat Minds: Why Evangelicals Don't Think and What to Do About It. So I was offended at that title, and I hope that we find out more about that. I also heard a rumor that he is the great-great-grandson of Arthur Guinness, the Dublin brewer and founder of the Guinness Brewery business and legacy. Dr. Guinness lives in McLean, Virginia with his wife Jenny, and I would invite you to offer him a warm welcome to Patrick Henry College.
Well, thank you for coming. I want to start. We're going to spend most of the time talking about Oz's new book, which has the title A Free People's Suicide. That's also a provocative title. Sustainable Freedom in the American Future. That is just recently published by InterVarsity. But first I want to ask you about growing up in China, because you spent almost the first 10 years of your life in China and then left after communism took over there. What's your, I won't say your fondest memory, what's your most vibrant memory of that period of growing up?
Probably the years just before the communists took over. The incredibly dramatic years when I was born, I don't remember. Right. And I've heard from my parents' stories because we were caught between the Japanese invasion and the communist resurgence.
This is 1941 when you were born.
Yeah. And so 17 million died in the Japanese invasion.
Including two of
my brothers. Yeah. We were in a famine in which 5 million died in 3 months, which was graphically described by Time magazine, and my two brothers died there too. I nearly died, my mother nearly died. My mother was a doctor, but there was nothing she could do. No food, no medicine. And she felt she could have been a ballet dancer, she said, or a stockbroker for all the use she was as a doctor without any medicine. And people were dying just like flies. But that was before I remember vividly. But I do remember the years in Nanjing, because they just experienced, not long before, the horrendous rape of Nanking. And people were still reeling from that. And then you had the years building up to the apprehension about the communists coming in. I remember in January 1949, my dad said to me, "Son, we're in trouble. Chiang Kai-shek just flew out this morning to Taiwan." And sure enough, 3 months later in May, in came the communist troops by the hundreds of thousands, and the reign of terror began. And the whole town was festooned with loudspeakers. And in the morning there were trials, and parents were informing against their own children and vice versa. And in the afternoon, public executions. And the fear was palpable.
And you were able to leave in 1951, but your parents were still there until 55, is that right?
That's right. My parents are under house arrest, but they were allowed to entrust me to friends who took me to Hong Kong, and I flew back to England.
And your father died 10 years ago, but before that he went to China, and you were telling me was able to actually meet some of the people to whom he administered 50-some years.
He went back the last year of his life. He was just short of 90. And it was like a nunc dimittis, Lord, let thy servant depart in peace experience. He met people he'd led to Christ 50 years earlier. And we happened to live in Henan then, which is the epicenter, the explosive growth of the church, the fastest growth of the church in 2,000 years. And so my father met people he'd led to Christ 50 years earlier, and he came back just so filled with joy, he was ready to go.
That's a testimony to perseverance of those individuals in China, and then also the way that seeds sown many years before can produce a bountiful crop when we, in some ways, least expect it.
And trust. I mean, there's so many people today talk about legacy, as if we could figure out what it is we've done. We don't. We're faithful. We obey. We do whatever the Lord tells us. And many of the things that we've done, the fruit may be beyond the horizon. And I think we should drop this notion of legacy and aiming for what we think it will be. No, just be faithful today.
So journalists have a tendency to often look more at the surface than what's down deep. I'm wondering, since you worked after school, you worked for the BBC. Were you able to go down deep in any of your reporting? Is there a favorite story that you can recall where you were able to get at the essence of things and not just be at the surface?
Well, one of the things I did was I was with the Everyman program, which did documentaries, and they were an hour long, so they were, for television, in depth. And we covered the role of religion in Reagan's election. And I remember in 1979 being, I can't remember where it was, but next to a New York Times reporter. He said, "What are you covering?" And I said, "Well, the rise of the Christian right." And Reagan, "Oh, come on, there's no story there." And then just 3 months later, they were doing full-page spreads on the story. And as a typical example, the New York Times is so tone-deaf, spiritually. They didn't pick up what was happening.
Yeah. So in 1984, then, you moved to the U.S. Why?
Actually, just came for 6 months to do some research on a book on America. Became the American Hour a little later, and 28 years later, still here.
So were you not allowed to leave after 6 months? Or?
No. I don't actually talk about it terribly much, but put it simply, for the only time in my life, I had a call where I heard the words of the Lord audibly.
And what specifically did you hear?
Well, that's what I say. I don't say too much about it.
But now I'm asking. Is it?
And I'm not answering.
And you're not answering. And you know why? Because this is a free country. Okay.
But
so,
in essence, it was, I want you to leave Europe, come to the U.S., and do whatever I show you to do. And we've come.
Okay. And so you've had then, for nearly 30 years, you've been able to write about what you've seen here and what you've explored. And let me ask a pointed question then. What's the best thing about America that you've discovered, and what's the worst thing?
Well, I still think the best thing is relatively simple and obvious things like the entrepreneurial can-do spirit. I mean, go back to Europe. Well, it's always been done this way. Do you really think we can do that? It can't be done. The climate hangs low, not only in weather, like England, but also spiritually. Whereas here, there's still a sense, sometimes it leads to crazy ventures, but you can do it. There's freedom. Now, that's lessening, but I love that American can-do spirit.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the lessening. And here I'm going to quote several passages from this very literate and well-reasoned and well-written book, A Free People's Suicide, Sustainable Freedom in the American Future. Here's one of the things you write. I'm wondering if you could comment on it. You write, "It is possible to be free at the constitutional level in terms of the structures of liberty, but to lose freedom and become servile or anarchic at the citizens' level in terms of the spirit of liberty," end quote. Now, do you see that happening in the United States right now?
I think it is happening. Put it this way, Marvin. The reason I looked at freedom, you know Augustine's idea that to really understand a nation, you look at what he called its loved things held in common. Mm-hmm. What is loved supremely? And there's no question that America's supreme love is freedom. So the state of freedom will be the deepest indicator of the state of the health of America at any time. But what Americans forget is, on the one hand, freedom is the greatest enemy of freedom. Mm-hmm. In other words, freedom can never be taken for granted. It's a very challenging idea. So you can never be complacent. Now, if you look at the history, say, of freedom, it was Montesquieu, the French writer who's behind Tocqueville, who first pointed out that to sustain freedom, you need structures of liberty and you need the spirit of liberty. Tocqueville later calls it simply the law, and then the second, his famous phrase, the habits of the heart. Mm-hmm. And Montesquieu rightly said, you can have the structures and they might last forever. But if you lose the spirit, you lose the habits of the heart, then you're in trouble. And I think today, if you look at American freedom, we've got a permissiveness in almost every area. I mean, currently something relatively trivial like, say, marijuana, that's going to go too. I mean, there's nothing that can be said no to now. But you know, Churchill used to say, Alexander the Great would say about the Persians of his time, they would never be free because they didn't know how to say the word no. And Americans have lost the capacity to say no to things that are wrong. And it's part of this general ungluing, unraveling, permissive license that is just leading to chaos. It's negative freedom run wild.
So we've pioneered theme parks in this country. I mean, starting with Disneyland and Six Flags over Texas and the other Six Flags and so forth. But in a way, the whole country is a Liberty theme park.
In effect.
In effect.
And you've changed the meaning. I mean, I was at Oxford with Isaiah Berlin in his last years. And he was famous for that distinction between negative freedom, freedom from, and positive freedom, freedom for or freedom to be. Clearly, you need both. You've got to be free from the things that are constraining you or chaining you or whatever, like addictions or oppression. But you need to have positive freedom too, whereas almost all current American freedom is negative. Get the government off our backs, get anyone out of my back, you know, let me alone to be me, don't tread on me and all that sort of stuff. Conservatives as well as liberals.
What's an example of the positive freedom that we don't have that we should have?
Our Lord. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. In other words, freedom requires and assumes you know who you are and who you're to be. So it assumes a vision of truth. It's not just a formlessness, the permission to do what you like. It's the power to do what you ought, as Lord Acton used to put it.
Now, this in some ways sounds like the things that would be coming from the Christian right that you saw when it was growing back in the late 70s and the 80s and so forth, but you've actually been very critical of that at times. So how do you have positive freedom without starting to think as Christians that we're a majority and we can run things to the benefit of everyone else?
I have to be very clear about my criticisms of the Christian right. Okay. Usually on the issues, say, against abortion or in favor of traditional marriage, I was 100% with them. Mm-hmm. But what I usually attacked was their tactics. And above all, the politicization, trusting politics to do more than politics can do. A great mistake. Actually started by the left back in the 20s and 30s. But the other thing, put in the 19th century language or the language of William Wilberforce, they did the Lord's work, but in the world's way. So our Lord, for example, told us to love our enemies. And you can see Wilberforce had an incredible love for the people who hated him, and actually mugged him and attacked him physically twice. But he prevailed through love, and it wasn't gushy in any sentimental way. Whereas the Christian right often shamelessly demonized and stereotyped and so on, and we're paying for the bad ways they fought it. But on the issues, I'm with them.
Is there a specific example of that wrongful behavior that you would point to for our instruction?
Well, what you could do, say, is take almost any decade of Christian right, take some of the direct mail letters, spread 10 copies out, and just analyze every word underlined in red or green.
Only red or green.
Only, you know, the words underlined.
Right,
You know,
right.
and they almost all appealed to fear, and our Lord said, have no fear, or sometimes almost hatred, and so on. And those are just typical of the sort of tactics. There were whatever it takes tactics, which were the going concern of the day, but they weren't Christ-centered tactics, and we're paying for it. And as you know well now, the defection from the faith by the younger generation is almost unprecedented in American history, and it's partially, mostly connected with a revulsion against the Christian faith in public life as represented by the Christian right. It's disastrous.
And you're saying it's more the methods than the principles that the younger generation is revolting against.
Yeah, I had dinner 10 years ago with the founder of MTV, obviously very astute, knowing how to persuade teenage opinion and so on, 20s opinion. He said to me, if the pro-life movement knew how to be persuasive, he said if they were all like the DeMoss television ads, It's a Beautiful Life and so on, they would have won the debate 10 years earlier. He said, they're all picketing, preaching, pronouncements, protest. Where's the persuasion?
Now that's changed somewhat, right, in recent years, and in fact the pro-life movement does seem to be winning the debate, but you're saying, but the tactics have improved. Let me ask you another, here's another statement from your new book. Few, if any, superpowers in history have been in deeper debt than the United States today. Now, what would you do if you were a U.S. Senator, let's say, coming up, and we have the debt ceiling question and the growing $16+ trillion and so forth? What would you do if you were a senator? At what point would you say no?
Well, that's a much more complicated issue than you can deal with in 20 seconds. But I would say what I'd like to see, I'm not a senator, what I'd like to see from the Senate and the Congress is much more realism. I mean, you had, for example, yesterday, David Brooks talking about the fact the present choices about medical entitlements and so on automatically mean the decline of America militarily. Well, that's fine. Those are the choices that are being made, but they're not discussed openly in Washington. And if there's one thing this country lacks, almost above all others, it's real leadership. Now, I remember as a boy having the privilege of meeting Winston Churchill. I certainly remember growing up under him, and every great speech, it was seasoned with history. It had an incredible realism, as well as the rhetorical, poetry and brilliance to it. But where are the statesmen? Where are the statesmen? I've been once with one president at Camp David helping him to prepare a State of the Union address, 6 of us and the president. And at the end of the day, he said, I promise you it'll be a short speech, it'll be long in vision and short in public policy proposals. Well, it was the longest speech in American history, and it was endless public policy proposals and almost no vision. Where is the Churchillian statesman-like vision of where America is today realistically? It's not there. Leadership is one of the biggest crises.
I think we could guess which president that was, but could you disclose that in case we were poor guessers?
No, that was Bill Clinton.
Yeah, longest, yes. Yeah. Another, well, this is, let's thinking about Bill Clinton and perhaps some other leaders. You quote John Adams saying, is there a possibility that the government of nations may fall into the hands of men who teach the most disconsolate of all creeds, that men are but fireflies and this is all without a father? Is that where we are right now? Have we fallen into that position?
What Adams gloomily foresaw, we've arrived at. And really, you look at our postmodern philosophies, we are there. And I think one of the most deepest dangerous things is a lack of a foundation for human dignity. We're yet to reap the harvest of that. Abortion, maybe, but we're yet to reach the full harvest. But if we go on with the views of Peter Singer and many of the new atheists and so on, America will lack a foundation for human dignity, which is going to become very powerful in this country in a way we haven't yet seen anything so far. So yes, what Adams foresaw, we are now harvesting.
And the students here are going to be living through this. What do you suggest that they should do?
Well, it's a much wider issue again. As Christians, our challenge is to go back as close as we can to the gospel and to truly be the church, and increasingly we're likely to be a counterculture. Mm-hmm. But as that happens, we're going to be seen to be the defenders of many of the things that people accuse us of as being enemies, like reason or human dignity. We will be the last great defenders of reason and of truth. We will be the last great defenders of human dignity. And so this will be a privilege, it'll be a great challenge, but we should look at these foundational concepts behind our Western culture and civilization and see how in the gospel we have that privilege and that task of defending these things today, not just theoretically in apologetics, but practically, as the early church did, hospitals, orphanages, and so on and so on and so on everywhere. Our privilege will be to repeat that story in our time.
So we need to understand that we are a distinct minority, people developing, living in a counterculture. What are the other things that we need to do to prepare ourselves for this?
Well, so asking these deep questions, Marvin, which I love. If we had longer, my own deep conviction. Where are we? I think we're at an Augustinian moment. So just as St. Augustine had the privilege and task of living at that pivotal moment after 800 years of Roman dominance, he lived through the siege of Carthage and the siege of Rome. That was the pivotal year. 800 years, a fall beyond belief. In other words, the world, they'd known it, gone. And he laid down the vision of the church's response. That was the bridge that led through the Dark Ages and eventually to Christendom. We, not 800 years, we've had 500 years of Western dominance, from the early Portuguese circumnavigators, the Spanish, the French, the British, the Dutch, and so on, down to the last, the American century. And Western dominance is at its sunset.
So it's clearly, you're saying it's clearly over. There's nothing that can be done to bring it back in some way?
It could be, but we don't see the signs of the leadership. My book, for instance, Mark Knoll was accusing me of being negative. When I wrote the book, I was invited to Congress, and one of the congressmen, who's a veteran, said to me, "I like your book, I only have one quarrel with it, far too optimistic." Right. And I've been accused of both extremes. Now, I do believe that as Christians we should address the situation with realism, but always hope. And as I understand it, there's nothing in America's current predicament that could not be resolved to an incredible degree by returning to a deep understanding of the first principles of the Republic. In other words, renewal is possible if there's leadership, vision, etc., but that's what we don't have at the moment.
So you're not suggesting that as soon as these students graduate, they should move to northern Idaho and become survivalists?
No, not at all. Then, take all the... I'm reading as many of the precedents of people who lived at an age when the world they knew had gone. Mm-hmm. One of them, clearly, Daniel. So after centuries of being in the promised land, living as the chosen people, Daniel's generation are in a pagan empire, and Jerusalem was destroyed. But you can see how he serves God even in that pagan empire. So we don't want people who are Christian survivalists. No, we've got to engage with faithfulness at the very heart of power still.
And you don't get a sense from the book of Daniel that he was depressed about all this.
Not in the slightest.
He prayed in the slightest.
Because God was sovereign.
So let me ask, just quoting John Adams, let me quote a little bit from Thomas Jefferson and ask whether you agree with this statement of his that you quote or not. Jefferson famously said, "It does me no injury for my neighbor to say that there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket or breaks my leg." end quote. I mean, is that true? Does it do us no injury for our neighbors to become polytheist or atheist? Does a self-chosen God or no God lead to abortion and theft and assault and other things? When should we be paying closer attention to, in a sense, the theologies of our neighbors, and not just, in a sense, going out of our Liberty theme park?
Well, as you know well, Jefferson is much quoted and highly lauded, especially here in Virginia.
Indeed.
My son went to a little college down in Mr. J's hometown. But I think he's dead wrong on that. The fact is, he could say that because most people in his day, while they could have been any number of the denominations, they were Christian.
Right.
Whereas today, when you have the pluralism of worldviews, and some of the worldviews have no, say, place for human dignity, that simply wouldn't be true. And the notion that ideas don't have consequences is utterly foolish. And we're moving into a world where we're soon going to reap on a far greater scale some of the consequences of these malign ideas. So Jefferson's dead wrong on that.
And then, again, how then shall we live in the society where people have ideologies and theologies that, in essence, say that it is okay to kill unborn children and pick our pockets and so forth? What?
If you read the last essay of Immanuel Kant, he talked of perpetual peace. If you read the last book of Nietzsche, 100 years later, he talked about a war of spirits. Now, we're much closer to Nietzsche than Kant. Kant was wrong. Right. Now, in this age of a war of spirits, everyone is now everywhere, it's said. And it's not just little private religious preferences, but entire worldviews, entire ways of life, elbow to elbow with other entire worldviews and ways of life. Now, that requires of us as Christians, one, that we really know how to wage spiritual warfare. It isn't just intellectual arguments. But two, that we do have powerful apologetics, because there's so many different positions now, and we need to know them. We need to know where they lead, what the consequences are likely to be, and how to argue with them persuasively. So we need apologetics and very much spiritual power in prayer.
No, my wife and I were in Detroit last week, which is a very challenging environment in which a number of young Christians are moving in because it's very much a frontier. It's almost becoming deurbanized. There's agriculture right within the cities and so forth. You're saying basically we have to get used to living in intellectual frontier circumstances. And so training ourselves, the students here, as opposed to students in a lot of other places, are gain familiarity with the different philosophies and so forth. Once they graduate from here, what do you recommend that they do as part of their continuing education? How should they keep learning at that point?
I often say I had the privilege of going to Oxford, as some others in the room did. I've learned far more after my doctorate at Oxford, just by simply keeping on reading and thinking. So I think the key thing is not just to get a good degree, but to lay down a lifestyle. We talk of sort of eating right and eating well today, but we've got to do the same with our minds, knowing what we don't take our information from. And far too many are trusting, say, the internet rather than reading books today or whatever. We need to make sure we have a wise, healthy, balanced diet of keeping abreast, obviously beginning with the scriptures daily, and then reading things going out from there. And so the whole of life becomes a growing experience and a non-stop education.
I have more questions about the book, and then shortly we'll turn to questions from the floor here. But this last comment of yours makes it necessary, I think, for me to refer to what Graham Walker said in introducing you when he mentioned the title of your book, which was Thin Bodies, Flabby, Fat Minds, or what?
Fit Bodies, Fat Minds.
Yeah, and what should we? I'm gonna ask for a minute synopsis of that book, if you can remember it. It's been a while, but you came up with the title, I guess, and so you're stuck with it, with having. Yeah.
Oh no, well, I came to Christ in the early '60s. And it really was a revolution when Harry Blamires wrote the book called The Christian mind,
Uh-huh.
in essence saying in 1963 that there was no such thing. Now that set our generation going on thinking Christianly, which is the term he introduced into the scene. But it's still appalling to me how few people, I mean, of course, a huge part of, say, evangelicalism has taken to that like a duck to water, and both in scholarship and at the ordinary level, there is much, much greater thinking there was than when I came to Christ. But that said, there are still huge tracts of the world of evangelicalism and the Christian faith at large that still don't think, and that's appalling to me.
And when these students graduate and are in their local churches, I mean, how practically, and let me ask for any specifics you can suggest here, should they themselves and help their fellow congregation members keep thinking and learning rather than just kind of ignoring the things and living day by day?
Well, a lot of people have to go back to churches which simply don't and won't think. And I always say when they do, you've got to keep it very simple.
Okay.
Got to keep it biblical. So it's not something about eggheads. Oh, no. It's biblical. We're loving God with our minds, etc., etc. And when people are resistant, never make statements, because we tend to get frustrated and raise questions. What's Jesus talking about here? And how does that apply there? When Paul says this, get used to being the question raiser who's pushing people to think when they haven't, so they see it for themselves. In other words, we're not there to tell them they're benighted or whatever.
Okay.
No, we want them to discover it is more faithful to love the Lord with our minds.
Okay, so we can learn Socratic dialogues in that sense.
But actually, our Lord was a gadfly long before Socrates came on the scene.
Right. Couple other questions then. You already referred to the whole issue of negative freedom, which is, let's say, freedom from oppression, whether it's a colonial power or alcohol, addiction to alcohol or something else. But positive freedom. Can you speak a little bit more about that and concretely? What does that mean? And in order to arrive at more positive freedom, do we need a revival? Do we need a reformation? I mean, how do we get there? And what, in terms of positive freedom, should these students keep in mind as far as ordering their lives so it's not a disordered life in a disordered society?
Mm-hmm. We definitely need Reformation revival. Call it restoration, call it renewal, call it revival, call it renaissance. I don't care the term you use. Okay. We certainly need that because the church is at a very low ebb today. But short of that, if we don't see that in the next 10 years, 20 years, or whatever, we still have a biblical notion of freedom. So we need to, the Anglican prayer book, thy service is perfect freedom. What does that mean? God has given us a way of life, including the law, which if we enter into it and live faithfully and obediently, we will discover we are most free to flourish within it. And we've got to really understand that our Christian ethics and our Christian notions, these are enabling higher freedom. They're not constrictions. And turn around the current thinking on its head, where freedom is just the permission to do what you like without any control.
So Gertrude Himmelfarb speaks about a remoralization of society in the sense of, and is that similar to, in a sense, positive freedom, where you're actually thinking about living moral lives and not just the negative freedom? I'm just.
But I think things have got so far that notions like remoralization have to be given really solid Christian content of discipleship and so on, if they're to have any meaning for us today.
Okay. Let me ask another metaphor you use is the golden triangle. And perhaps you could just explain what that is.
Well, that's probably the most original part of the book. If you go back to the framers, there's nothing more brilliant and more daring that they did than reckoning that they could sustain freedom forever, because no one had ever done it. But no one asked, how did they do it? Well, they didn't give it a name, so my name for it is the Golden Triangle. Tocqueville calls it the habits of the heart. But if you look, again and again, they say these three things. Freedom requires virtue, leg one. Virtue requires faith of some sort, leg two. And the third leg of the triangle, faith of any sort requires freedom, and the most original part of the American experiment is the First Amendment. Now put those together. Freedom requires virtue, which requires faith, which requires freedom, ad infinitum, like the recycling triangle that goes on. That is actually a brilliant, daring suggestion as to how freedom can be sustained. Modern Americans don't even know it, by and large. Now then, how then do you hope freedom will be sustained? Well, the simple fact is, unless you've got a method, it won't.
And this can be then, in a sense, a societal upward spiral rather than a downward spiral, because you're having each of these is aiding the others.
Should be.
It should be. And okay, my last question for now: how did the founders define virtue? Because I mean, you've written about the founding. I wrote a book called "Fighting for Liberty and Virtue," which seemed to be what the founders were about. But is their definition of virtue somewhat different from the way the word is used today?
Oh, definitely from the way it's used today, because
But
we have an incredible fear of virtue and of virtuecrats who will impose their virtues on us and all that sort of stuff. Now, but for the founders, though, as you know well, the word virtue is actually rooted in the Latin word for courage and strength. But it was a kind of one-word summary for all ethics: honesty, loyalty, patriotism, and supremely character. All those will be part of what, in one word, is called virtue. But today we've got to unpack that. And, you know, just to say, in the business world, people have shown the incredible importance of trust. Who would have thought that something as simple as trust would have to be retaught? It has to be, though, today, and almost nothing can be taken for granted. The foundations have to be put back into everything. So virtue, I just use, and the framers did, as a one-word summary of all that we need of ethics and character.
okay, questions from y'all. I mean, you're going to have to you're going to be living through this strange society into which we are now entering.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to ask a little bit of clarifying question on what Dr. Lasky asked about going back to churches where perhaps they don't think, and specifically us coming out of college, we're often the youngest in that environment. How would you recommend going about and still thinking and bringing up these things with many people who are much older and wiser in a lot of ways than we are?
Obviously, a virtue at any age we're at is humility. And the trouble is, if you read, say, Helmut Thielicker's Letters to a Young Theologian, people come back from college, back from seminary, and they know everything once they've had one semester of Greek or whatever. And so the first thing is to go back and to be truly humble. And that's why I think asking questions is the simplest way, because you're pushing people back. They're anti-intellectual. They're afraid of thinking. Thinking means you might go to Harvard and become a liberal or whatever it is. You know, and you go to Scripture, and there's so much about the mind. And so the Old Testament, you love the Lord our God with heart, soul, and it's Jesus who adds the word mind. Why? You're just getting people to look at different passages and say, why did Jesus say that? What does he really mean? What would that mean for us today? Just humbly, but persistently. But also remember, you won't be young forever. It happens. It happens. I sat where you sat once.
So you want to teach respect for elders out of self-interest as well as. So, next question. Over there in the back.
A very key person in the church, incidentally, is the pastor. If you look at Puritan sermons, their introductions are important, linking it to what was going on in life, but the application at the end. And if you have pastors who are not afraid of thought, but truly, Tim Keller's a wonderful example of this. He's able to take Scripture, but he really understands Manhattan life and Manhattan issues and relates it. And then when you see the Word addressing the world in such creative ways, people are no longer afraid, because the Word is the dominant one. It's the fear that underlies so much of the anti-intellectualism. We've got to say to our generation as a whole, have no fear.
Hello. I just want to say Tim Keller is one of my absolute favorite authors and pastors. But my question actually also has to do with developing the Christian mind. How much did your experience at L'Abri affect your views on the importance of developing the Christian mind? And did that importance reveal itself to you before L'Abri or after that experience?
Well, I came to faith in the very early 60s, and I was at university in London, and suddenly the counterculture was exploding. Swinging London, the Beatles, Ingmar Bergman films, all that sort of stuff, as well as what was happening in Europe and in Berkeley. What I remember is no Christian that we knew understood any of that. So at London, we had the best teachers in Britain teaching us. John Stott, Michael Green, Jim Packer, names that many of you would still know today. They were our teachers every week, but not one of them related any of it, and John Stott later admitted this often, related it to culture. And here we were in this exploding scene, and Christians didn't understand it. Then Blamius wrote this book, The Christian Mind, and we suddenly saw something was missing. But the first person I saw who actually did it was Francis Schaeffer. And I remember this funny little man in Swiss knickers, and there he was with a blackboard connecting dots that no one else had connected. Films, art, theology, politics. And I remember the first time I went to L'Abri, just for 3 weeks. Those 3 weeks were more revolutionary in my life in a practical level than my conversion. Obviously, conversion was more important. But suddenly, this liberation that you could think Christianly about anything and everything, and in the light of the gospel, you could understand and make sense of these things, it was, intoxicating. I'll never forget leaving lectures and seminars and going out, and L'Abri's in this magnificent place looking out over the Rhone Valley with magnificent peaks opposite, these huge starry skies, and realizing that all truth was truly God's truth, and we're in this universe of God's and we could relate to it all. It was mind-blowing, and I've never looked back from that 3 weeks. I'm still as excited now in my 70s as I was then in my 20s. Since then, at Oxford, I was studying sociology of knowledge. Mind-blowing stuff. I remember going to India and studying under a guru and staying in an ashram. Again, spiritually, tough stuff, but when you see how the gospel relates to it, and Christian truth is an answer to some of these huge dilemmas or these alternatives, there is nothing more intellectually and spiritually exciting than the wonder of God's truth. So I did owe a lot of that to Francis Schaeffer. He wasn't a scholar. Any scholar could pick holes in some of his books and arguments, but he had a vision and a passion for God and for truth, which I've never seen in any other human being since.
If some students here aren't familiar with Schaeffer, would you suggest they begin with The God Who Was There or one of the other books?
Try The God Who Was There.
Okay.
To be honest, I've never read a single book of Schaeffer's.
Okay, all right.
I heard most of them at L'Abri, and he never wrote any of them.
Oh.
They're transcriptions of lectures, often written up by Jim Sire at InterVarsity. So they're not, some of them, very well written. And he wasn't a scholar.
Sir, thank you very much for coming. We're all pretty young here, and we're really energetic. We're interested in the social, political, and moral controversies of our time. But for those of us, when we go back home over break and go back to our families, I know that a lot of us, when we talk to our parents, we're speaking to a generation that will be saying, the war is pretty much lost. I mean, we can fight as many battles as we want, but the war itself is over. So what would be your response to that? Would you agree or would you disagree?
Well, what sort of war are you referring to?
Well,
You're referring to the recent political activism of the culture wars. Now, they may be over. God only knows who we are. I was arguing earlier that we're at an Augustinian moment. But are we, through various global trends we needn't go into now, on the dawn of an extraordinary golden era for humanity? Are we on the edge of a new dark age that could be barbaric, or will we muddled through somewhere in the middle. I think only the Lord knows. But like St. Augustine, we have to have a vision of the gospel and of living the gospel that is so faithful that that vision will be like a bridge that can go through the darkest, most troubled waters that may come. So much of the culture war, I would argue, was not the right way to fight anyway. And thank God it failed. And we now need to learn how truly to be Christian and wage a deeper war. And the warfare in the scriptures is supernatural. It's not political. They never waged political warfare. We've got things all muddled up. So I'm in some ways glad that the culture war is lost. Or put another way, Marvin and I were talking about Europe at lunch. Many Americans come up to me as Europeans and say, are we going the way of Europe? As if that's terrible. And sometimes I say, somewhat facetiously, I hope so. Because the good thing about Europe now, which is truly the most secular and dark continent in the world, things are so bad, they're good. There are very few illusions in the church in Europe. There's very little complacency in the church in Europe. If you're out for Christ, you know where you stand. Here, there are far too many illusions, far too much complacency still, which means there's all sorts of wrong resorts that people are resorting to. And we've really got to go back to being the church and knowing what the gospel is. That will be our salvation through whatever's coming. So don't go along with that sort of defeatism.
Given that education is so important to reforming the culture for Christ, do you think that Christians in particular should take an even more active role in promoting, say, homeschooling on billboards, on freeways, and so forth?
I'll leave you to decide whether billboards are the best ways of approaching anything these days, but that's beside the point. Clearly, American education is in terrible shape. At the same time, education is a graveyard of idealists. If God calls you into the reform of education, well, God bless you, and go into it. It's an incredibly, desperately needed field. But all of us need to think of what it means to grow in wisdom all our lives. And that's what concerns me. Because far too much American education is about credentials and all these sort of things, not about wisdom and knowing how to live and how to think and how to discern and these sort of things. And that matters far, far more, than piling up degrees and so on. So yes, if you're called to education, truly God bless you. I've seen a lot of people in Washington called to that. Many of them no longer in the fight because it is one of the toughest areas for all sorts of reasons. But if you're called to it, terrific. I'm not sure billboards are quite the best way to do it, though.
Bumper stickers are what we really want to move towards. Anyway. Let me ask one question about an issue that will be coming up this year, namely immigration. And you note in the book that a problem with, in a sense, the educated elite here in this country, and you say this is a good line. The problem is not wolves at the door, but termites in the floor. Tell us about the termites in the floor and how that refers then to what we should be thinking about this issue of immigration.
Well, that line is not in connection with immigration, but the point there is simply, if Lincoln is right, and most historians are right, America's challenge will be Americans, it won't be external enemies. In other words, you've beaten Hitler, you've beaten Stalin, you will triumph over Osama bin Laden and his successors, but the real problem in America will be Americans who will undermine the republic. That's the point of the termites in the floor.
Okay.
Immigration, though, I think, I've been in Washington nearly 30 years. All the discussion of immigration, English as a second language, border control, and the economic issues, no one talks about civic education. In the good old days, which weren't always so good, when there were tight controls on immigration, there was an insistence on civic education. So the people came, the Irish, Italians, whoever, they were Americanized through the public school education. But now, very few Americans can say what Americanism is, and there isn't any civic education to speak of, except in homeschooling, certainly not in the public schools. So when people come, they're not Americanized.
Yeah.
And they're going to change. As you know, Samuel Huntington, he was saying that soon immigration will put more of a stamp on America than the revolution, because there's no civic education.
Okay. Other questions? Looks like you've answered
In the
every
middle.
question
No, it's in
people
the middle.
have.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about the concept of habits of the heart, which it seems has often become an inward, personalized thing, and how we can bridge that out into transforming or revitalizing the decline of Western Christian civilization.
The true habits of the heart, or call them virtues, or call them the fruit of the Spirit, call them Christian character, call it what you like, they are not only internal. Now start back with the Greeks, for whom they didn't have any of this sort of language. There were three possibilities for the Athenians. You could have people in Athens who they called idiots, tribespeople, or citizens. Now the idiot wasn't someone who was a little loose up top. The idiot was someone who only looked after his own private concerns. Got too many of those in America today. The tribesperson was the person who only thought in groups. Whatever the group thought, decided, wanted, that's what he or she did too. Of course, in Athens, it was he, not she. The citizen was the person who knew what he or she thought was best, but also had an eye for the common good too. And the Greek education was trying to make people who might have been idiots or were probably tribespeople, turn them through education into citizens. And that's what the habits of the heart should be. So it isn't just Christian virtue. For us, that's the core of it. But what does it mean for American citizens? You take, say, your motto, e pluribus unum. Everyone would say that's not only America's motto, it's your greatest achievement. But you stop now and say, what on earth is the unum? We all know what the pluribus is. We've got diversity coming out everywhere now. What's the unum? I'm still English and European. I take playful fun in groups, sometimes CEOs, sometimes church groups, just saying, all right, take a bit of paper and write down 10 things that are essentials of the American unum. And very, very few people, certainly in CEOs too, can get beyond one or two. Now, Patrick Henry, you could probably get all 10. But the simple fact is that America's lost touch with its unum. So all you have is the pluribus, the diversity, without the ongoing unity. Back to the Americanism again. And so it's not taught as a habit of the heart. So the habits of the heart are not all subjective. They're not all individual. They include citizenship things.
So I'm going to ask you then, unum on top, what 10 words should go below it?
Well, I'm challenging you Americans. I'm English, but you know, things as simple as the rule of law, separation of church and state, freedom of conscience, and a whole number of things like that, which 19th century school kids could well have written down. And they played their way out in daily life in very practical ways. And many of them we need today. I mean, you take, say, this last year with the administration, the health mandates and so on, freedom of conscience. Everyone believes in it, but no one really knows what it is, and so we can override it easily without people being shocked when they've overridden it, because it's just a word.
Now connected with the contraceptive or abortifacient mandate, there may be an administration move towards allowing schools or nonprofit organizations possibly to be exempt from that. But that, I mean, that will continue to be an issue, but another issue in connection with that might be companies that are explicitly Christian founded based companies, like Hobby Lobby and others. Companies, should companies be able to have religious freedom?
Well, there shouldn't be laws which are such a direct violation of freedom of conscience. That's the point. And the odd thing is, and if you look at, say, the Obama administration, Hillary Clinton made what is probably the best speech on religious liberty made by any American public official ever. And Obama made, last year, a very, very good speech on religious freedom. Their talk is terrific.
High up in the ladder of
Yeah.
abstraction, but coming down to specifics.
But he didn't realize, and I heard him say, since, say, the Catholic hospitals get more than 90% of their money from us, surely we can say who give them the money, they should follow what we want. He didn't understand the issue at all, despite having given these speeches, presumably written by some good speechwriter. There's ignorance about these things which are fundamental to America, and we've got to apologetically, persuasively, and live it out too, put the core back in some of these essential foundational principles that are American.
So
And in that case, they're global.
So if President Obama were to call you in, as President Clinton did at one point, and you had 30 seconds to try to get something essential into his understanding, what would you say?
Boy, I remember when Schaefer was invited to meet Nixon, he really prayed, knowing he'd have 10 minutes, what one point he'd make. And I would certainly pray too. If I had an hour, freedom of conscience would certainly be on the short list. I don't know how long it would be. I could think of some other things.
What one point did Francis Schaeffer try to make with?
I don't remember what he finally did. No, I think what he said to Nixon was that everyone will finally behave true to their assumptions. He was talking about Nixon's approaching Brezhnev at the time.
Okay.
Worldviews matter, ideas have consequences. Everyone at some point, whatever they say, will live true to their fundamental assumptions. I think that was what he tried to get over to him.
Interesting. Let's see, we have maybe 3-4 minutes left for other questions. Yes?
One question for you is, I know as Americans, sometimes we can be guilty of putting patriotism over Christianity. I would ask, where is the proper balance, and how do we reach that balance?
Where's the balance? Where do you draw the line? Those are usually impossible to say, except in nice words. Generally, though, nationalism is the danger, patriotism is good. And nationalism has been where you have an idolatrous view, and you see it in the extremes like, say, Nazism in Germany and so on. Patriotism, God has given us all a place, and we should be proud of and attached to the place in which we grow up. But one of the marks of it is that, for better or worse, and you're able to say, thank God for this, and to be honest, that is wrong. I mean, a lot of, say, the secular world today throws the baby out with the bathwater in terms, say, of the founders. Can Christians who often idolize the founders say they were terrific here and here and here, but they were really off base here, or the hypocrites there, or whatever? Can you give a really Christian balanced critique of your own country? And do you have the courage to speak out when your country is wrong? And so on. So in broad principles, I would say patriotism, absolutely. Always under God. Nationalism, no.
Chuck Colson was enormously influential in trying to help people think Christianly about things. Now that he has graduated, who would you point to among American leaders now as people trying to improve our thinking and leading in that way?
You mean Christian leaders?
Christian leaders.
Well, we've got masses of wonderful scholars, which we didn't have on a scale when I came to Christ 50 years ago, like Mark Knoll and many, many others. And of course, you've now got wonderfully thoughtful, intelligent pastors like Tim Keller, whom we mentioned earlier. But CT is not the standard bearer of Christian thought as Carl Henry hoped it once would be. And there's still a huge gap between, say, the thinking evangelicals and the pragmatic activist evangelicals and so on. We still haven't reached a healthy position on this.
Okay. Any last questions here? I see one down here in front, and can we get a mic over here?
Just in light of what was just spoken, I recently discovered Nancy Pearcey, and she's written some wonderful books. Namely, Total Truth is a fantastic book that I would wonder what you would say about that.
Yeah. Nancy would gratefully attribute much of what she's learned, not only to Chuck Colson, but also to Francis Schaeffer. No, she's a wonderful example of a better way of doing it. And there are many, many, including some of your eminent professors in this very room. Take the name of Dr. Veith or Dr. Aikman and people like that. There are many, many.
All right.
Thank you for those kind words about our faculty. They are quite a remarkable group. Let me just remind those here in attendance today that you're welcome to come back tomorrow at 10:45 a.m. We'll have Tucker Carlson here of CNN. That should be fun. At 12:20 tomorrow, Stuart Taylor, a Supreme Court expert, then come back next week for others like Steve Forbes, Kay James, and others. But for the moment, please express your appreciation to both Marvin Olasky and Os Guinness.
Thank you. Thank you.